But I want to just say that there is, as we look at Sabbath, there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of practices, there's a lot of misconceptions all around this topic. And so we want to clear away some of that stuff so we actually have a much better view of what is there. We will clearly not do a comprehensive, because I was not given that much time. And even when Vivian says I can push the edge a little, it is still not sufficient to be comprehensive. So we're going to dip into this just a little bit. So I wanted to start with just quickly, we'll look at Genesis 2. This is that passage that I talked about, in that one question, where we actually see God practice Sabbath. So it doesn't use the word, but this is what it is. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array, and in the midst of that was when God actually decided, he goes, I will rest from my work. And he blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy, because he rested from all work of creating that he had done. That's kind of a wild picture, isn't it? That raises concerns for folks too. What do you mean? He stopped working? What? What is causing everything to hold together? Oh my goodness. Did he leave us? Did he abandon us? No, and we see that throughout the rest of it. But the very first Sabbath was actually declared by God in Genesis, and this is important because a lot of times, because then we firmly plant it there. We plant it in Genesis. We plant it at the end of creation and before we screwed it up, right? With what we typically refer to as the fall in churchy settings. When human beings decided they could do it better, they got a better sense of what they wanted to do. But this is not something that is begun as a reparative thing to the fall. This is actually clearly planted and done in the midst of the creation and the creative order. So that, I think, is pretty important. It's also interesting to consider then that means the very first human beings experienced this rest time with the Creator as they lived, as they worked, and in relationship. So that's just kind of I find that really fun to consider. It's not until we get to Exodus that it becomes commanded, and it is actually after God has brought them out of Egypt through Moses' leadership. It is interesting to note that the whole reason that Moses went was because they were not having the opportunity to worship God. So the acts of justice and everything were all in line with the worshiping of God. And so he said, let my people go that they might worship me. And we're going to talk in just a minute a little bit about some of the differences between Egypt and its gods and the God of Israel, because I think that's a big part of our understanding of Sabbath. But just to kind of note, it's in chapter 20. This is that fourth commandment where he says, remember the Sabbath day to set it apart as holy. For 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you, your sons, your daughters, your male servant or your female servant, your cattle, or the resident foreigner who is in your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So not only do the men of the house get to rest, but the women get to rest, and the kiddos get to rest, and the servants rest. It's not that the owners of the house get to rest and the servants are going to run around like crazy trying to make it so that they can rest. Everybody rests. Everybody rests. And it gets more clear in Deuteronomy as far as the contrast. But I want us to just look for a few minutes, just a few, at Egypt and their gods versus Israel and their God. So we have Egypt and their God, okay? And then we have, so Egypt, their gods were confiscatory. So they basically took things. They demanded endless production, and they were insatiable. And you get to see that played out As you look at Pharaoh, if you read through Moses' encounters with him and looking at the first part of Exodus, his major objection is, but they can't stop working. That's not okay. There's bricks to be made. And then in anger, he makes it even more difficult. But the production must be continual. And it is like the pyramid actually is a pretty good picture of it, right? Because it requires an incredible amount of very cheap labor so that those on the top can have the life that they want. And yet even they are constantly anxious, right? In contrast, we have the God of mercy. See, it didn't go the way it was supposed to. Steadfast love and faithfulness. It's a big, huge difference here. We have a commodity that focuses on production and bricks versus covenantal fidelity and relationship. That command economy, that demand, that has that workforce that produces wealth versus an economy of neighborliness. Isn't that interesting? That Sabbath actually has as part of its core not only the worship of God, but the care for the neighbor. All in the household experience rest. It is not merely those who have wealth or ownership or things like that. The whole community. Then we have the restless, does that go on to the, I guess that goes on to the next slide. So let's go, okay, restlessness and anxiety versus with, you may have to go to the whole thing because I don't think it's gonna do it. There we go. So with the restlessness, there's no time for rest. It's gotta be cheap labor. Competing for positions. Anything sound familiar to anyone? Anyone? Competing. People are a commodity to be used. Versus the God of Israel, there's this press to rest and to trust. As you go through the passages as they are wandering in the wilderness and all of that, there's the experiences of manna. And you may remember that they are told to gather it every morning, only enough for the day. Except on the sixth day when they can gather double because they will not be doing it the next day. But keep in mind, these are folks who are used to an economy where there's never enough for them because it's always being taken to give to others. And so the thought that there will be stuff tomorrow is very difficult to grasp. And so they do go ahead and get too much, and it rots in front of them. Only what they can eat for the day is sustained. And miraculously, the stuff on the sixth day tends not to rot on the seventh day. God is teaching this people who have been very dehumanized by their circumstances, by treating them like things and a commodity, teaching them how to trust. That ability is not initially there, so they have to learn it. Doesn't make it all that surprising that we struggle to trust too, right? Because it's something that has to be reestablished or built. What I find really fascinating looking at the contrast between them is that the gods of Egypt and Pharaoh are very anxious from top to bottom, all of them, because there's always the concern that they may not be able to hold on to enough, that they need to withhold, they need to store up, because you never know what may happen. Whereas this other God wants rest for all, and he is not dependent on endless work. He feels like it's going to be okay for you to only work 6 days. It will actually be okay. You will have what you need. And he doesn't seem to be very anxious about the full functioning of creation. That's what goes back to that whole, he sat down and rested on the seventh day. He didn't all of a sudden, he didn't go, oh my gosh, the earth, it might tip the wrong way, I've got to keep on that. Oh, they're doing this, I need to get right in there. He trusted that the processes that were put in place were actually gonna work. So he doesn't hover and go all the time. He trusts that those things will work. And he encourages a care and respect for the neighbor and the other. The final thing in this really boils down to one of the passages, I think it's the one in Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy at some point it talks about is that when you have an idol, the people who create them are an awful lot like their idols. You're reducing God into something you can hold. Now, I years ago when I talked about idols, I brought it was not extraordinarily culturally sensitive, I have been told, but I brought a stuffed animal in, and I go, I declare you God, and it fell over. And I went, and I put it back up. I declare you God, and I worship you, and it fell over the other way. And I go, ugh, and I just put it under the podium, because that's what you can do with an idol, right? It's a thing. It can be put in a closet when it annoys you. But it also, when you give it power and you declare that it has certain demands, they are endless. You can never meet them. You will never hear that it is enough, because it will never be enough, ever. And that's what happens when God is actually viewed as an object and it is a commodity, and people are a commodity, versus the God of Israel, who is a subject, not an object, a person, and he is an active agent rather than just a tool, however you want to describe it. So both in the creation and then in this command, we see the Sabbath as kind of the pinnacle moments of them. As it's really being explained, this is amazing. Let's sit back and rest and actually pay attention to it. God is amazing. You need to actually stop and rest and care for those around you. And there's actually, I think it's probably pretty accurate too, that it requires that Sabbath actually is pretty pivotal in our ability to actually care for our neighbor. But think about it. When you're in the structure where everything is a commodity and you're competing for resources, you are competing with the person that otherwise might be your neighbor. So there's only so much you can do because you are competing with them. And they may have something that you want, and therefore you might take it. They may have the spouse that you wanted, and therefore you take it. They may have something that you want, and therefore you kill them in order to get it. That makes sense in a commodity-oriented kind of setting. Whereas when the focus is on this God who is generous, who is loving, who provides rest and is not anxious, then you can turn and say, oh my goodness, you need rest too, because it doesn't have that limited sense of economy. Does that make sense? Am I freaking out the economists in the room? Just saying. So moving on, I just want to say that there's one of the things that I think is particularly helpful to consider is that this actually allows us two aspects for Sabbath. The first one is going to be that Sabbath is actually a declaration. It is declarative because it's actually an alternative to the gods of our world, to gods of our culture. Sabbath is an opportunity for us to declare the character of the God we worship. He is a God of rest. He does not have endless demands upon us. We are declaring that we serve one who is not insecure or anxious or confiscatory. He does not need us to produce for him. That is a very hard thing for many of us to grasp. God does not need us to produce for him. How differently we would live if we believed that. The gods of Egypt and the gods of our culture demand exclusive authority over all we do and want us to produce everything exclusively for them. But our God's exclusive calls us not only for relationship with him, but with our neighbor. And thus, 5, 6, how many of the commands? It's starting with number 5, going through 10. So 6 commands are actually focused on how you relate to others. And that flows out of a place of rest. So let's look at that a little bit more. So we have it's an alternative helps us to declare that people are not commodities. It also is an opportunity for us to say, our God is a God of rest. Keep going. And then it is active resistance. So for those of us who are very justice-oriented, Sabbath is an act of resistance. For my activist friends who go, I can't stop, there are things to be done. This is crucial. I was just talking with an InterVarsity staff, and there's one of our things that we are looking at is what we call the 2030 calling, which is seeing more students around the country actually know Jesus. And in the midst of that, the other thing that has been said from the top down is that everyone is to practice Sabbath weekly. And then once a month, take an entire day from work just to focus on prayer. It takes away the sense that for this to be reached, for more students to be reached, it's on us. And places it firmly back on the Lord. If it's something He's given, then it's something that we can trust Him to do. Okay, so an act of resistance. Let's go through real quickly. So we have anxiety. It resists anxiety of our culture and around us. I find that particularly exciting because anxiety, I feel like, is one of the leading struggles that students have, and that people around me have. Sabbath is an act of trust in His provision and His character. It provides us time and space too. How do you focus on a neighbor when striving to meet the demands of acquisition? So it breaks the striving and allows us to actually focus on rest. Coercion. Coercion actually flows from restlessness and anxiety, because if it's a desperate need to be done, then we begin to force people into our will and to do what we think needs to happen in order to meet that goal. And so Sabbath, choosing Sabbath rest, presses against the demand for all to work. It's very interesting, like when you look at, so one of the people that I was reading in preparing talked about having spent time both in Iran and in Israel. They practice very different Sabbaths, different days, different foci, but everything stopped on those days. You couldn't catch a bus. There were no stores open on the Sabbath, which meant everyone had rest. And she talked about the flurry of activity for the hours leading up to Sabbath, because all the cooking needed to be done, because there would be no cooking during the Sabbath, so that all could participate. I think it could take some creativity for us to think through, how do we practice that resistance against coercion or the press for others to provide for us, or to use them in the midst of the Sabbath practice. The third one is exclusiveness. I find this one particularly exciting as well, because it's an avenue, it presents the avenue for us to have welcome to others. In the passage that we looked at, it talks about the foreigner in your midst, the servants, everyone gets rest. It feels particularly important in our culture at this time to really wrestle through what does it mean to have a posture of welcome, and to care for and welcome all into God's rest, into our space, into our communities. The space, our communities are not based on what people can do for us, but on God's mercy and His compassion and His justice. So there's that part. And then there's the multitasking. How many of you try to do 3 things at once at least, multiple times per day? Anyone? Anyone? Don't lie. Multitasking is one of the biggest things that we do. It can come, with this, the phone, right? So I'm checking my text messages. I might also be getting a phone call while I'm checking the text messages, and then I'm having a conversation with you. God forbid I'm doing all those things while I'm driving. And yet it happens, right? Because we're trying to do so many things, because there's more to do than can be done. Sabbath stops that, okay? And therefore, even with that, it presses us to focus on one thing at a time, to worship the Lord, to be in conversation with the person across the table, to enjoy the rest together. Okay, so now I'm going to have you break up into groups of 3 because we're going to have some conversations real quickly. You ready? Okay, so this first I'm going to move you from one conversation to the next, but I'd like you to move into groups, and you're going to talk about these questions. We're going to look at the gods and idols around us, so I want you to think about the values of our culture and GW specifically in relation to the gods of Egypt, what the demands and expectations are, and how does Sabbath combat them. So 5 minutes. Okay, ready? Break. I'm going to throw out a couple things, and I'd like you to throw in some things, and Deanna's going to write them up there as well. So Sabbath practice is done alone. So one of the things that I actually do for Sabbath rest is the pottery. Now my pottery instructor is also a believer. He does not do pottery on his Sabbath. It is his job. It is not my job. And it brings me rest, and I cannot begin to tell you the things that I learned about Jesus as I do it. I'm also currently studying Revelation on Sundays. We're going to be doing Revelation at Urbana. I think it's going to be kicking, but I want to soak in it before I have to work in it, if that makes sense. So I want to do that. I also will have books that I want to read that are what I call my Sabbath books. So I don't read them the other times of the week during Sabbath, outside of Sabbath. They are just for Sabbath. How about you guys? What are things that you might do alone for Sabbath rest? Journal. Good. What else? Walks. Amazing. Hikes in the woods for those, who are willing to go in the woods. Because I know for some folks that is not restful. What else?
Art.
Taking a bath. What was that? Art. Good.
Make myself a nice meal.
A nice meal. Yeah. Good. There's all kinds of things you can do. Cooking, right, so cooking, making a meal, sometimes the making of the meal is done alone, and that brings joy, and then it is for a group of people, which then brings in the next one we're going to do. But there's all kinds of things. I would encourage you guys to continually keep a list with one another of creative ideas of things that you can do for Sabbath alone. The next one is practices as a community. So after you cook a meal, you can have a meal with folks. Playing games can be really fun as long as they don't get competitive and people get nasty. You know who you are. You know who you are. One of the writers that I read was talking about how sports is great as long as the competitive I've got to win edge doesn't kick in. If it does, maybe that shouldn't be done on Sabbath. If it's for the fun of the relationships and doing it together, that's one thing. But you can tell when it shifts. And then maybe that's not a Sabbath activity. My team that I'm on up in Baltimore is going to gather on Saturday late afternoon on the bay, by the bay. We're going to go kayaking and hang out and picnic. And it's our celebration of the end of New Student Outreach. And so that is also the kickoff for my Sabbath day, because I go usually from 6 on Saturday to 6 on Sunday. But that's an idea. What are other kinds of things you can do in a group or a community for Sabbath rest? Any ideas?
Museum.
Go to a museum, especially if you talk with one another while you go. Otherwise, it becomes a joint personal time. Yeah. Anything else you can think of? No?
Walk together to the monument.
You can do that. That can actually be very restorative. Spiritual conversations. Actually, just good. So one of the things that I wrote down was storytelling.
Yeah.
learning more about friends, just enjoying each other's company. You could always go to a movie, but then you need to have a conversation. Otherwise, it is again merely an individual activity done in a group. That's called personal public time. You know what I'm talking about, public? You know what I'm talking about? That can be really helpful. Anything else you can think of?
Get bubble tea together.
Oh.
Bubble tea. I love restauranting it, so I love going and eating food that I have not eaten before. And my fallback, when I've run out of ideas or I'm just too tired to come up with ideas, almost always to go get Ethiopian. But you know, thinking about those foods that are particularly gracious and wonderful for you. Okay, so here's just two more things very quickly. One is that you guys are going to have the opportunity to have a community Sabbath for next week. Next week is Sabbath week with InterVarsity at GW. It's the first one. How exciting is that? You guys are in on the ground floor, and the idea is that there will be no I'm getting this right? No planned activities, no structured events, no leadership responsibilities for a week. And it's gonna happen every 7 weeks this year, I think.
That's the
right?
goal, yeah.
That's the goal. Hopefully it will not be like Jubilee with Israelites, that never happened. So, but it's a full stop, boom. It does not, however, mean that you guys don't want to see each other, or that you should not actively look for time to hang out. But it's time to let go of the organized activity and just spend time with each other. Do more restful things without the agenda. Perhaps it will mean having a meal with a few people, or it could be the monument. Well, that's the following week, right? Yeah, that's the following week is the monument tour. But doing something together, but also having some of those activities that you can do individually. So don't look for a leader to plan your Sabbath rest. Prayerfully consider what would be really fun, what would be restful, what would remind us that we are neighbors with one another, and that the people that I look at around me are not a commodity to take care of my needs. But the Lord will provide what I need. So what I'm going to have you do is just for 2 minutes, and then we're going to be done. 2 minutes, you're going to turn back to the group, and you're going to make some concrete plans. You may not have them all together, but you want to walk out with at least one thing. So you're going to turn to each other, and you're going to go, what's something that you would like to do on your own? What's something that would be fun to do in a community this coming week? And if you can actually come up with a plan for one of them, that would be great. But even just coming up with some possibilities that you can then follow up with each other and going, so what are you going to do during this time of no well on either campus? No small group Bible studies this week. No active outreach this week. What will you do? Okay, 2 minutes. I think a lot of people
But 5 grades, like 5.
don't Sabbath because they feel like they haven't worked hard enough all week long, and so it's not okay to actually take a full day off. And that if they actually started working the whole week, then it would be justifiable to take a Sabbath, but they don't feel like they've earned it. I don't see anything in the creation story or in the commandment that says when you have worked hard enough on those 6 days, then you get a prize of rest. It is, you will work all of your work on 6 days, and then on the 7th day you will rest. I think that we actually would get more done on 6 days if we actually thought of it as we have 6 days to work, and we truly rest on the 7th. And being truly rested, you will actually have the energy and the focus to get done those things during the week. And the trust that whatever doesn't get done will have to be handled by the Lord. But when we view it as, I just have to get a little bit more done, so this week I can't take a Sabbath, we do not resist our culture that says, work yourself to the bone and to death, because all you are is what you do. That is our culture. You are a commodity in this culture. Just watch whatever news station you want to watch, depending on your political leanings. Read whatever news source you want to read. No matter what it is, what you will see is that people are viewed as commodity. And this presses against that and says, no, you were created to know and be known by, to love and be loved by the living God and to live in community. So let me pray for you. Jesus, thank you so much for this time and this space. Thank you for the invitation that this fellowship is in the midst of responding to practice rest, to practice Sabbath, not only individually over the course of a week, but together as a community and how they choose to structure the life of the fellowship. So Lord, give them rest and peace. Lord, may your joy and peace overwhelm and press out anxiety and the things that would prevent them from experiencing that. In Jesus' name.